Today's episode is going to be all about fear. Now, I'm very aware that fear can encompass so much of our lives, so I'm going to share some key tips with you about how to really tackle that fear head on and prevent it from impacting your life in a way that you really don't want to. Hi, I'm Kalli, your go-to life and mindset coach, and I'm here to support you on this crazy journey we call life. Okay, so fear. Now, fear is one of those things that I talk to my clients so much about in coaching sessions, simply because fear can dictate and shape the way that we approach so many aspects of our lives, from going on a first date, to going to a job interview, to speaking in front of a group of people, whether it's public speaking or whether it's even just, I don't know, just talking to people in a group meeting at work. So I thought it might be really useful to share some key tips and tricks to help you to tackle fear head on, work out how to control and manage it in certain situations, and get you living that life that you want without fear getting in the way. Now, fear is a really interesting one for me because I've experienced and witnessed fear in so many different situations, and it kind of stems back from when I was a primary school teacher. So as a primary school teacher, I used to watch the really little kids and how they would just be so fearless. And it didn't matter what they did, they didn't care. They just had no fear. They were completely fearless. But as I started to watch them grow up and get into the older side of the education system, I really started to notice fear kick in a lot more. And a lot of the time this stemmed from their perception of themselves towards others, or their awareness of others around them, or just their self-awareness. And then I started to apply it to my own life, which was quite interesting because I was the kind of kid that grew up on a stage. I was always on stage, whether I was singing or whether I was dancing. I started singing from the age of around 4 years old. And so being on a stage was so familiar to me, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. But then as I started to make more of a career, so if you followed my journey, you'll know that I was a singer-songwriter in my mid-20s. And during that time, as I really started to try and make a go of the singing side of things in my late teens and my 20s, fear really started to kick in for me. And just being on a stage would be so fear-inducing that I'd start to feel my voice closing up, and I would just get stage fright a lot of the time. I'd still do it, but the fear within me was so much stronger, which is really interesting when I'd spent all my life on a stage and then all of a sudden it just was so fearful for me as I started to get older. And the reason being is because the perception that I have of that situation became different. When I was a kid, I'd be on stage and I didn't care what others thought of me because I was just doing what I loved. I really loved being on stage. I loved singing, I loved dancing, and I didn't care. Whereas as I got older, I started to become much more self-aware. I started to become more aware of the people in the crowd, what they thought of me, whether they thought I was singing well, what they thought to my music, was I good enough? All of those things were just spiraling through my head, and I started to change the way that I perceived being on stage and that whole experience and what that meant to me. So that's something to be really mindful of, because as we start to think about fear, one of the key things I want you to remember is you are the one that creates fearful environments and fearful situations. No one else does. So we experience lots of different things in our lives. Okay, singing on stage is a little bit more out there, but even talking in a group meeting at work, going on a first date, they're not designed to be fearful experiences, but we create them to be fearful experiences based on the perspective that we have of those situations. And I'm going to talk to you more about these situations as I go throughout this episode as well. So be sure to listen up, because I'm going to share some really key tips and tricks that are going to really help you when it comes to those situations too. Now, I'm going to share this notion with you of, and it's a little bit more out there, I'm going to try and keep it really simple. But when we experience a fearful situation, and you might notice these feelings even as I'm mentioning the word fear to you, we get the same physiological symptoms. We all do. So the same kind of feelings that happen in our body, of the nervousness in terms of the shaking, the racing heart, the nausea, the butterflies in the tummy, the closed up throat, all of those different physiological symptoms. Now, what if I told you that those physiological symptoms are the exact same ones that we have when we're excited? It's really weird, isn't it, when you think about it? Because, and this is what scientists have found, that all of those physiological symptoms that we have when we're nervous and we're scared, so those things in our body, are exactly the same as when we're excited. So all of the nausea and the racing heart and all of the heavy breathing and the sweating and shaking, we get those exact same symptoms when we are excited as when we are nervous or fearful. Now that's really interesting to note, because really we can start to trick our brain. We can start to tell our brain that in those situations where we naturally find them quite nerve-wracking and quite fearful, instead we can say to our brain, no, this is exciting, I'm really excited. You're going to feel the exact same things in your body, but you're applying a different meaning to those physiological symptoms, the things that are happening in your body. So rather than seeing these as feelings of nervousness, you're seeing them as feelings of excitement. Now, okay, I get it. It's not that easy to trick your brain. It takes a lot of work and a lot of willpower to really channel those feelings, those physiological symptoms we have, more into the feelings of, well, this means excitement, it doesn't mean nervousness. And the reason why it's so hard to trick our brain into changing that is because we have a very old brain. Put it simply, our brain hasn't evolved in the same amount of time as we have. So we've evolved throughout society, and the way we are in society has changed, but our brain is still stuck in caveman times. Our brain is still designed to keep us safe from things like saber-toothed tigers and all of those crazy things that around us generally aren't going to be an issue. So what happens is when you start to feel those physiological symptoms, or you're applying what you see as a fearful situation and you start to feel those things in your body, your brain is going into alert. And it's thinking, whoa, no, this is fearful, we shouldn't be doing it, let's back off, I want to keep you safe. But ultimately, that's really frustrating, because sometimes you need to do these things. Sometimes you need to talk in a meeting at work. Sometimes you have to get out on that first date and go for it. But our old brain is trying to stop us from doing that. So sometimes it's not as easy as just saying to ourselves, oh no, I'm excited, this is excited feelings, it's not nervousness feelings. Sometimes it might come quite easily to you, and that's great. But if not, I'm going to share some of the techniques with you that I think are going to be really useful in these situations. So I'm going to share a little example with you in terms of understanding how we can feel both excited and nervous at the same time, and those physiological symptoms are exactly the same. So I'm going to take you back to around 2016. I was traveling America with my friend at the time, and I really wanted to do a skydive in California. So as soon as I landed on American soil, I booked it straight away, because I'm one of those people, if I've paid for it, I won't chicken out, because I really hate parting with money and it going to waste. So it was the first thing I did, and I had a couple of weeks to wait till this skydive, and I was really excited for it. And then the day came. And the day came and I was so nervous. I could feel all of those symptoms in my body that are very standard of nervousness, the nerves in my tummy in terms of the butterflies, the shaking, the racing heart, the sweats. And I turned up to this place, and if you're unfamiliar with the process, you have to sign a disclosure form to say that this company are not going to be responsible for your death, which ultimately is going to invoke a lot of fear within you, naturally. And then I met with the guy who I was going to be strapped to the front of, in terms of when I fell out of this plane, 13,000 feet in the air. Had a chat with him, he put me in my harness and talked me through how it would work. And again, really fear-inducing, because I was looking in the eyes of the man who had my life in his hands, basically. I was going to be strapped to him, he was the one in control of the parachute, and I had no choice but to instill a lot of trust in him. But fair enough, I got that this was going to be quite a fearful situation. It's an adrenaline situation, ultimately. Okay, so in California at the time, it was the middle of summer, and sadly California are very prone to wildfires, and ultimately that's what happened. And there was a big wildfire at the time of me doing this skydive, and because there was so much smoke in the air, I then got delayed for 2 hours because it wasn't safe for the plane to fly. So naturally, you're probably kind of experiencing it yourself as you're listening to this story. I had 2 hours worth of fear ahead of me. While I was waiting to get onto this plane. I was already really nervous, and now I had to wait another 2 hours. But interestingly, as I reflect back, during that 2 hours, I went through periods of feeling really, really excited and really, really nervous. But during that entire 2 hours, my physiological symptoms, what I was feeling in my body was exactly the same, whether I was nervous or whether I was excited. So that just puts it into perspective for you in terms of how your physiological symptoms can be exactly the same whether you're nervous or whether you're excited. And you are the one that tells your brain whether that is because you're excited or whether it's because you're nervous. Now, there's another real age-old saying that we tell ourselves when we are going through or starting to experience a fear-inducing situation, or what we perceive to be a fear-inducing situation, and that is, what's the worst that could happen? You could be telling it yourself, or someone could be saying it to you. What's the worst that can happen? And sometimes that can be a good thing to say because it helps you to rationalize the situation. But if you are a particularly irrational person in this situation where you know you're going to feel and experience fear, sometimes that isn't the best thing to ask yourself. If I go back to my skydive situation, asking yourself what's the worst that can happen is not a good question to ask, because ultimately it's going to be, okay, the parachute doesn't work and I'm going to fall to my death. I'm sorry to be so morbid about this, by the way. But anyway, so asking yourself what's the worst that can happen sometimes isn't the best in certain situations. But we can also acknowledge that that's not always the best thing to ask us when we're just in normal situations that we see as fearful but actually aren't potentially designed to be fearful situations. So let's take public speaking, for example. If we said to ourselves, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Which is a very common thing that people ask us when we go into these situations, particularly if we've got to speak in front of a lot of people. We'll naturally start coming up with, oh, okay, they might not like my talk, or they might fall asleep, or I might forget my words, or I might stutter on my speech because I'm so nervous. But you might notice that as I'm saying these things, my energy is dipped. So, okay, it's all well and good as saying what's the worst that can happen, but ultimately your brain is just firing out all of these things that are making it a bad situation. So, yes, we're kind of rationalizing the situation, but you're allowing your brain to think of all of the bad things that could possibly happen. So you're not going to go into that situation with a lighter mindset. So one thing I want you to ask yourself is, what's the best thing that can happen? Rather than asking yourself what's the worst thing that can happen, ask yourself what's the best thing that can happen in this situation. If I took two people and one person said, oh, what's the worst that can happen? Okay, all of this stuff can happen. And then I had another person who I said, right, say, what's the best thing that can happen? And they reeled off all of these things. Oh, they might love me. It's going to boost my confidence. They might ask me to do it again because I'm so good. It's going to just boost my morale and make me feel better and amazing about myself. They might laugh and enjoy the situation or the talk I'm giving. They might find it really engaging and engage in really good discussion. You're noticing that difference in energy between someone who's saying what's the worst that can happen and think of all the bad things, and someone that's saying what's the best that can happen and think of all the good things that can happen. Remember, I think I mentioned it in episode 1, everything is energy. Energy is so key in our mindset. So if you're thinking of what's the best that can happen, as you're thinking of all of those good things that can happen, you're instantly boosting your energy. And naturally, you're going to go into that situation with a very different mindset, with a very different energy source that's then going to build and ultimately just eradicate that fear, because you're putting a more positive mindset in place instead. Now, there is only one time really where I would say that asking yourself what is the worst that can happen is actually quite informative, and only on this occasion really. Now, when we ask ourselves what's the worst that can happen, when we're asking ourselves that, in our brain, we're unlocking that inner voice, that inner critic in our mind that's telling us all of those bad things and reasons why we shouldn't do something. Now, the reason I say this is because when we're giving reasons as to what are the worst things that could happen, chances are a lot of that is based on your internal dialogue that you say to yourself. So I'm going to put this in the context of first dates, just because this is really familiar for me as well, because in my 20s, I used to dread first dates. I used to hate going on them. And the reason why I was so fearful of first dates, if I listened and I said to myself, well, what's the worst that can happen? the inner voice in my head would be saying things like, well, what if they don't like you? What if you're not attractive enough? Or what if you think you've had a great time and then they ghost you? Or what if they meet someone better? And in that moment where I'm saying to myself, what's the worst that can happen? And they're all the reasons that I'm telling myself is why. What I'm ultimately doing is saying to myself, well, I'm telling myself that I'm not good enough. They won't want me. I'm not attractive enough. They'll find someone better. Now, that's really important to acknowledge, and it's a lot that I had to work on in my 20s as well. And the reason being is because I find first dates, or I used to find first dates, being a real fearful situation because of the way I perceived myself, the way my inner voice, my inner critic spoke to me, feelings of not being good enough, feelings of being not wanted or rejected. So I had to do a lot of work on myself to make sure that those self-limiting beliefs weren't getting in the way of what is naturally supposed to be an enjoyable and exciting situation. Now, if you do this exercise and you acknowledge those limiting beliefs, but you are struggling to shift them or know how to shift them, I give you a really useful coaching technique that I use with almost all of my clients, to be honest, in episode 5. So if you haven't listened back to that episode yet, make sure you do. It's a really useful technique that helps you to really shift those limiting beliefs and put some better, more positive beliefs in place about yourself. But yeah, so some key take-home messages so far from this episode. Focus on the energy. So remember, our physiological symptoms can be exactly the same if we're nervous or fearful or if we're excited. So you can convince your brain that you're going into an exciting experience rather than a fearful experience. But if you struggle with that, think to yourself, what's the best thing that can happen? Rather than saying to yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen, think what's the best thing that can happen. And that will instantly boost your energy and get you entering that situation with a completely different mindset and ultimately help you to just enjoy the experience instead. Then if you do ask yourself what's the worst that can happen, this is a really useful technique to get you unlocking those limiting beliefs, that inner critic in your head that's telling you reasons why you should be scared of these situations. Remember, a fearful situation is created by you. They're not designed to be fearful. We are social beings. We are designed to interact and engage with other people. So going on a first date or talking in front of others shouldn't be a fearful experience. It's the perception that we decide to put on those situations that determine whether we're going to find them fearful or not. So sometimes unlocking self-limiting beliefs by asking ourselves what's the worst that can happen and listening to that dialogue that you're telling yourself in that moment is really useful to understanding what your limiting beliefs are. And then pop over to episode 5 and I'll help you to understand how you can shift them and transform them into something much better for you to move forward into the life that you really want for yourself. Now I'm going to end this episode on a bit more of a bittersweet moment, I suppose, but it's going to really help you to understand how fear can really get in the way of your life and how to not let it get you regretting, I suppose, what you could have done when you had the chance. Now, my amazing granddad, bless him, I'd lost him just over 5 years ago. And there's a conversation that sticks with me that I had with him not too long before he passed. And he was very reflective on his own life. And it's really interesting, isn't it, how when you speak to older generations that are coming towards the end of their amazing lives, they are very reflective and they do start to give you some life lessons, I suppose, a little bit of insight into life and how we should experience life. And I remember having this conversation with my granddad. We used to talk about life all the time, particularly towards the latter years. And he was telling me this story. So to put it into context, my granddad lived on the same street his entire life, and he loved his life. He had an amazing life. And in this moment, he's having this conversation with me and I suppose reflecting on what his friends have done. So he's ultimately comparing his life to what his friends have done. And he was talking about how his friends have gone off and seen the world and just done all of these amazing things with their career. And he then, in comparison, had spent his entire life on the same street. And it was really interesting to hear that back. And it links really nicely to one of my favourite quotes, and that's, we will only ever regret the things we didn't do when we had the chance. Now, we're going to go through life regretting so many things that we can laugh about as time goes on. We can regret a bad haircut. We can regret a fashion choice that we decided to have. We can regret a kiss that we had with someone that should have never happened. But ultimately, the things that we're really going to regret and resent, I suppose, for the rest of our lives, those things that are really going to stick with us, are the things that we missed when we had that opportunity. So when we've been given an opportunity and we've been too scared to take it, or we've thought of all the reasons why it might go wrong or it might not work out, and they're the things that latch onto you for the rest of your life. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, don't let fear get in the way. Don't let fear hold you back from what could possibly be some of the most amazing opportunities of your life, because you don't want to get to the end of your amazing life and then realize that you think, I could have done that. I could have been this. I could have had this if I'd have just taken that opportunity and not let fear get in the way. We can regret so many things, but the things that we regret the most are the opportunities that we didn't take when we had the chance. If you liked this episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.